Good morning, everybody. My name is KEIRA LOUGHRAN, and I'm the Associate Producer for the Forum here at Stratford. Before we get too far into proceedings, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. For those of you who are visiting the Forum for the first time, it's a series of events that extends throughout our season. They're one-off events, everyone is different, and we look to deepen our understanding and exploration of the themes and ideas in our season playbill. Today's event is around our production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's called Narnia's Mythic Life. And it came about from a conversation that I had with Tim Carroll, the director of the show, last year probably, where we looked and talked about what kinds of themes and ideas he wanted to explore further within this production. And we talked about the allegorical Christian references in it, and he said that he was more interested to look at the extended connections of the text to other diverse cultures and mythologies that existed around the world. He cited Joseph Campbell, and so to look at the mythology in comparative terms across the country, across the world. And so with that charge in hand, I looked to assemble a panel for this event and was really, really thrilled with the people that I found. I started with our in-house expert on mythology, David Latham. David is a long history with the festival as a director, and he's our theater training consultant, and he oversees the Michael Langham Workshop for Classical Direction. He's a master teacher and has developed a really unique way of incorporating mythology through his relationship with the works of Joseph Campbell into the theatrical process and into the process of an actor. So we're really pleased to have David here. And then I was amazed and really thrilled when Lee Maracle agreed to be part of our panel. Lee is a prolific First Nations author and critic. She's been published in many anthologies and scholarly journals worldwide. She was born in North Vancouver and is a member of the Stolo Nation. She's currently an instructor and professor at the University of Toronto. And through the Joseph Campbell Foundation, and psychology, and she's up from the Catskills in New York, where she runs a farm with her husband. She's a bit of a Renaissance woman, and when I contacted the Joseph Campbell Foundation, they said, well, the perfect person would be Lee, but I doubt you'll be able to get her. So I'm really thrilled to have convened this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the dialogue today. In our moderator's chair, we have the host of CBC Radio's Ideas program, Paul Kennedy. Paul is a huge supporter of the festival and generously moderates many of these sessions for us. He's an award-winning broadcaster and journalist. And through our relationship with CBC Radio Ideas, we will be recording today's session, and we're also live streaming it. So welcome to our live stream audience to join in our conversation today. I'm going to pass it off to Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, KEIRA. To establish my own credibility, I brought my copy of the Chronicles of Narnia. Actually, I won't look at when I bought it. It was a long time ago. What I will point out, though, is that there are only 6 volumes in this box set. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is missing for some reason. I have a feeling my daughter may have stolen it when she was 8 or 9 years old, but I can tell you these are much loved and much read volumes. Through actually now 2 generations at least. And I'm delighted to be here today because, yes, I'm in love with the Stratford Festival. I'm definitely in love with William Shakespeare, but I have been in love with C.S. Lewis for much of my life, certainly from when I first confronted him in these books. And these books were very important to me at one point in time. I'm delighted that this panel, KEIRA has assembled an amazing panel, actually, and I think it's time that we should just really jump in and get them first to state what they think they're here to do first, and then we'll open up into a general conversation. That conversation will include you as well. I think there are pieces of paper or something you've all been handed. If you have a question, jot it down and bring it to the attention of one of the ushers, who will then pick up the question from you, pass it to me, and I will mix it into the conversation as the opportunity arises. I think, David, since you are the resident theater person here, it's appropriate you should begin the conversation.
Okay. Well, I came to The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe first and the Narnia Chronicles as an adult. For some unknown reason, even though I was brought up in England, maybe I'm just a bit too old, I never read them as a child, nor were they read to me. So when I came to read these books, I looked at them in a very, very particular way. And I'm going to give you some of my history in terms of that, in terms of how I looked at these books. Many years ago, when I was a young actor and young director and young teacher, and I was living in Vancouver, a very close friend of mine was visiting one day, and she said, I want to tell you about something. And what she did was she told me this story. And she told me this story of a journey. And then she said, there is a man who's coming to speak at the University of British Columbia, and I think you should go and listen to him. So I said, okay, fine. And this man's name was Joseph Campbell. So I went to this lecture, which was actually packed out. And I heard this man speak, and he spoke of what he called the hero's journey. And it was one of those things like, I mean, maybe this is rather inflating it, but it was a bit like, for me, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. It kind of hit me like that. It was something that I totally understood intellectually, but it was something that I understood emotionally, I understood psychologically, and I understood viscerally. I immediately went out and bought one of his books, The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And I realized that somehow what I had to do was I had to find a way of experiencing this journey. And so I used this journey as a template for one might call a meditation or an imaginary journey. And this hero's journey, this template for the hero's journey, became for me a kind of template in my life. And I remember there was a particular time much later in my life when I was living in Australia, and I was going through a very, very rough time in my life. And I thought, well, you know, this maybe is what I had called the great test. And I thought, I've been through that. I've just really been through a really bad time. Maybe this is the gift. And saying that to myself, because I knew what receiving the gift felt like, it turned around my life. And then I started to realize that this work that I'd used in my personal life, really was underpinning the work that I do as a teacher and a director. And I started to incorporate this work into, first of all, into the work that I do with Mask, and then into the work that I do with plays. It became a template for the characters, the journey of these characters. Where are you on this journey? Are you crossing the threshold on this journey? Are you meeting with benevolent or malevolent forces? If this journey is yours, who are these other people in this journey? The other thing about being exposed to this work of Joseph Campbell, I also started to have a really deep understanding of metaphor. And again, to do with that which is visceral and emotional and psychological. When I worked in New Zealand, and I was very fortunate when I was in New Zealand to come in contact with some Maori elders. And when I was in Australia, I also had the opportunity to meet with Australian Aboriginals. And I realized that these people were working to find a deeper meaning in their lives and a deeper meaning in the words of their culture. And so this has been the underpinning of my work. And so when I first read The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, for me, what resonated so deeply within me was that this was the hero's journey. So that's my relationship to the Narnia Chronicles.
I think it's a great way to begin this conversation, too, because in some sense the journey wasn't accidental, but it wasn't planned either. And
No, totally not. I mean, that was what was so wonderful about it. Not planned at all. Vroom.
maybe starting at the other end, somebody who has Campbell definitely inside her psyche from the beginning. We'll get Lee. What?
Sure, and I'm actually, because I'm a contrarian, going to start from the other direction.
Okay.
I too have a collection of books like this that is sitting in my bag in back. It's also missing one, though I'm missing The Horse and His Boy. And I grew up reading these books. I had an older sister who read early, and I wanted to run as fast as I could to catch up. So when I think of the earliest books that I remember reading that were real books, not little kid books, they were the Chronicles of Narnia, and they became the language of my childhood in a lot of ways. My family, I grew up in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. My parents were academics. Books were important. Stories were important. And we spent a lot of time out in the countryside, and we actually had about 20 acres of land. It was a little meadow and a creek and a forest that we called Narnia. And so we actually had, when you would park the car in the meadow, there was a bridge across the creek, and my dad, who is an economist and a university professor, not an artist, managed to figure out how to burn Narnia and the Lion Rampant, which is the Narnian shield, essentially, onto this piece of wood. And so when we crossed that creek, we were in this place of magic. And so for me, these books were deeply mythic. I was, even though my folks dragged me to church, the Episcopalian church, every Sunday, I was a happy pagan as a little kid. And the other layers of story, the Greek stories, the Norse layers, the Celtic layers. C.S. Lewis was Irish, grew up in Ireland and then moved to England. He was a medieval and Renaissance studies scholar. He was a buddy of Tolkien's. They talked a lot about myth in their world, and he actually, incidentally, and I didn't see the Christian allegories until I was an adult and looked at them and went, really? Wow, that wasn't what I saw. And he actually, as he talks about it, even though he was deeply into thinking in the world, imagining the world in a very Christian way, when he wrote these, he did not characterize them actually as specifically him setting out to write Christian allegories. So as a kid, what I saw was the sense of possibility and the sense of power and the sense of the power of imagination. And as I looked at what these little kids did, and we played, my sisters and I played these roles. We were the Pevensies. On a good day, I got to be Lucy. My older sister always bagged Peter, but I thought Lucy was cooler. So I bagged Lucy a lot. And so we inhabited these stories in a very imaginal way, and lived into the mythology of these stories. And in this land out in the country, it felt like that's where they all lived. And it felt like, when I remember reading Prince Caspian, which is the second in not necessarily chronologically, but in his writing order, and so in my reading order, and that's the one, if you don't remember, where Narnia has forgotten its magic, it's forgotten its soul. And I always thought that that's where we were, as in this era, that somehow we had forgotten the pieces of myth and magic that were important to us. And so I knew absolutely with clarity that the moment that we pulled got back into the car and pulled out of the meadow, all of the creatures that were waiting for us to disappear came back out and talked about how we'd been there. And you could not shake me from certainty. And I'm still not totally convinced that isn't true. So for me, these stories led me in many ways to Joseph Campbell. So it was the other way around for me. And the sense of myth as a big force in our life is what drove me to getting a doctorate in cultural mythology. And I think I'm going to back off for a second and just talk a little bit about what I mean by myth, because we were talking a little bit behind the scenes before we started. And we have a tendency in this era to think of a myth as a lie. You know, somebody will say something is true, and you say, that's just a myth. Well, that's a myth conception, if you'll pardon me, pun, and you can smack me. the Greeks talked about myth as being the thing that is most deeply true and not true at the same time. Myths hold a very particular kind of truth. Joseph Campbell, in a moment of archness, once said, well, mythology is somebody else's religion. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think more deeply, he also talked a lot about how myth is metaphor. And so for me, when I think about myth, I think about them as the big stories that are sitting in our culture, the things that shape who we are, the things that we are sort of infused by. They're stories that we tell, but also the stories that tell us. So they're the things that we see as being big, deep truths that wander through our psyches, whether we're consciously aware of them or not. They're always there. And they're always framing how we see things. And they're always this amazing mishmash of things that we get from all sorts of different places. And to me, what's powerful about that is being able to step back a little bit and start to think about what are the stories I'm living in and why am I living in them? Are they stories that I've chosen, or are they stories that have been chosen for me? And what's the difference? How does that impact my life? How does that impact my community? How does it impact my hero's journey? How does it impact how I can go out in the world and do what I want to do? So when I look at this work, it very much so, and there are other, I think brilliant children's literature holds this more clearly than most places in the world. We've allowed that magic to live there in a way that most adult, quote unquote, work doesn't feel comfortable with, in this kind of, we want to be rational and we get weird about where faith abides and where thought lives and where imagination lives. So good children's literature, I think, is infused with this and invites us to think about how we can see the world in a mythic way, in an imaginal way. And my work these days is around that, is about trying to help people think about imagination in a very particular way and how you can leap forward, very much based in the narratives that we sit in. And so when I think about these stories, what they did for me most powerfully, and for my sisters, for my family, I think as well, and they've all landed in slightly different ways. But I think what they did was invited a sense of how do you live into your life in a way that is bigger and more powerful and more beautiful and more ultimately responsible on a deep level to the world than just being a little kid in suburban Pennsylvania. Like how are we living mythic lives? And for me, these books open that up. And I think that's really the heart of what Joseph Campbell spent a lifetime trying to do, is to try to help figure out where we build that meaning in our lives and how we make it. He talked a lot about how he didn't think we're searching for meaning, we're looking to make meaning. And so using the hero's journey as a construct, which is it's a cool idea. And he early on in his career talked about the monomyth, which you guys may have heard, the hero's journey being sort of the story that sits under all stories. He walked away from that a bit. He was not a fundamentalist about that at all as he moved on in his career. It was an early intellectual idea. But the cool thing about it is that there are pieces of it, I think, for everyone in the shape of it. And these stories hold many of those elements beautifully. And to me, the important part is that they invite us in to see where we live in that as well.
Thank you, Lee. This is it's fitting together like a very nice puzzle now. You know, out of what you said, I have this wonderful image of a meadow in Pennsylvania right now.
Yeah. It was pretty special.
I sort of wish we could all get in a bus and go there.
Okay, come on.
Because it's got another line from another book that comes strikingly home to me right now. It's that is, if you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
And so that meadow in Pennsylvania is someplace that's really quite precious.
We've got one in New York now that we're working the same way.
And is it still there?
You know, we don't own it anymore, so I don't know. But
This is Lee talking, by the way.
So yeah, we should jump to the other Lee, the first Lee. I'm the second Lee.
Yeah, well, Lee will bring it in some ways right round full circle, because David did mention the fact that in New Zealand he was dealing with Maori, he was dealing with Aboriginals in Australia, and now we have a homegrown Canadian here to tell us how it might fit into her.
A homegrown Stalo. We're still a nation in our own minds. Canada is 1867. And if I considered myself a part of Canada, I would have had to participate in our own oppression, which I did not. So that's why I say that. And we are still separated legally from other Canadians. For instance, you have your children educated in grade school for about $450 every year from K to 12 now. It costs us $15,000. So there you go. 30 times as much. We just don't have the same advantages. I just came across Narnia. I'm 65, and I quickly read the Chronicles of Narnia. I always say yes to things, and then I say find a library, because you can get something out of this. And I really found it interesting. Yes, there are there is a lot of Christian allegory in there, but the thing that I found most interesting is the separation between life and the fantastic world. We don't have that. It's just as likely that the shishot's going to come into this room with its two heads and threaten us as not. We don't separate the spirit world from the world of the dead, I guess, for you, and the living world. My grandpappy performed in theaters like this, Chief Dan George, so I believe he's here sitting with me now, guiding my tongue a little bit. And we work with our mythology. We don't inhabit it as it is. We transform it. We're transformer peoples. So my latest novel, Celia's Song, is about the double-headed serpent, the Shishul. Skrilich to some. But nonetheless, it's about the double-headed serpent. And essentially, the double-headed serpent came as a result of a terrible catastrophe about 10,000 years ago. And this young boy was going to kill him. So he drove to the bottom of the sound where I live, and it's the deepest sound in the world, supposedly, although I have to tell you, I doubt very much that some white guy took a ruler and measured it. But anyway, it's just what people say. It's very deep. Giant octopus, giant jellyfish, and giant squids make war with each other down there. And the double-headed serpent came from down there, and he swallowed the consciences of the men, and the men and the women went to war with each other. And that's why the little boy wanted to kill this. He's huge. And so he dove into the water. And this is what transpired. The serpent says, "Wait, don't kill me. We'll make a deal." Which then becomes the seat of Salish culture. Wait, we'll make a deal. And the deal was that he would be on our house fronts forever. And so you see those beautiful carved double-headed serpents with the spirit of the human in the center. But the teaching is that when a body has two heads that don't agree, or a split mind, as it were, then nobody wins. The body suffers. And so it has no body, just two heads. And what I got from that is that's what you folks have just recently diagnosed as bipolar disorder. Yeah, it is. And so I used that, those two philosophies, and turned them into a novel. Because the goal of our mythology is to make the story happen now. How would this play out if it was playing out now? And that's how we come out of a difficult situation. And the difficult situation that we've been in is 125 years of residential school and deliberate impoverishment. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're talking with the various government authorities about sharing the wealth of Canada, because we don't have a share of it yet. It was appropriated in 1867 by Canada. So the mythology becomes a part of that. Now, with Salish people, let's make a deal is the bottom line. We stopped being warlike after we came to understand that myth but it took us 8,000 years to actually understand it on the level that we do today. And I think that's part of where we differ with the mythology of Europeans seems to be for children. I'm still trying to work with my mythology, trying to understand it. And now I have to deal with Narnia. But I got something from Narnia about, and I don't know if this is C.S. Lewis or not, but the perfecting of words. We have a saying where I come from, and it's, words are sacred, they have power, they have impact. Excuse me, I try not to get too emotional. That read clearly in every single one of the Chronicles. And I thought, I think that's why I always honor the Irish that came here. I know that they came here under horrific conditions and that they were taken to the Huron Tract, this area, and that there was no road back. And I have heard stories from the citizens of the Huron Tract that they were starving, and a group of Anishinaabe came from Chicago, which means skunk cabbage, by the way. It's true. And they left behind pemmican, which is a food that the Anishinaabe eat when they're traveling, and some wild rice, and told them how to prepare it. And then they went home to Raportage and Kenora and Sault Ste. Marie and all those places that they came from. They survived, and I don't think that was Britain's intent, any more than it was Canada's intent for us to survive residential schools. So I wonder about the mythology and how it works in the citizenry. Clearly it doesn't work the same way. The mythology is not a governor of social engagement the way it is in my community. Rather than fight, we have to make a deal. And we're still that way. Although sometimes going to war seems really enticing. But we don't do it. Your commandments, the Christian commandments, we actually adopted one of them. We didn't agree with the others. I don't know if that makes us immoral, but you know, the business of no adultery, are you kidding me? And no looking at other people's wives and husbands, are you kidding me? Some people you can't take your eyes off of. So the thou shalt not kill is the one that we agreed with, and we haven't killed anyone in our community since we latched onto that. I'm a descendant of the Princess of Peace, Mary Agnes Capilano, and we have agreed not to kill, and so we don't. But we also don't kill for Canada. I think thou shalt not kill means thou shalt not kill. That's my mythology. It's my Christian mythology.
Let's start with something that I think we're pushing towards, and that is the different ways mythology is used or is adopted by or is incorporated into a culture or civilization. And they are different. I mean, you're describing something that's literally a black and white situation. This is the way white folks look at things, and this is the way Indigenous people look at things.
Yeah, I did say seems to look at it. I don't know actually how you look at it, but it appears that way to me.
David?
Well, I mean, I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that you say. When I was in New Zealand, and I went to work in New Zealand, the first place I worked in New Zealand was at the National Drama School. And the woman who ran the drama school had decided that what she wanted to do was she wanted to run the school according to the Treaty of Waitangi. And the Treaty of Waitangi had been signed in something like in the 1880s or the 1890s, which had said that 50% of New Zealand should be British and 50% of it should be Maori. And that particular treaty happened because at that particular time there were more Maori people in New Zealand than there were British people. But that did change. But Robin Payne, who ran the school, wanted the school to be run according to the Treaty of Waitangi. So that when I arrived at the school, I couldn't just walk into the school. I had to be sung into the school. And when I got into the school, they welcomed me, but they welcomed me and they welcomed my ancestors into the school. And they made way for me to come and to bring my ancestors with me. Yeah. The other thing that I relate to in terms of what you said was the Maori elders were in the school. So the actors did everything that actors do in drama schools, but they also worked with the Maori culture. And one day when I had been working in rehearsal and the Maori elder had been in my rehearsal, afterwards he came to me and he said, you know, we Maori people have a great respect for words. And I said, oh. He said, yes. He said, when we speak, he said, if you really want to speak, he said, what you have to do, he said, you have to stand. When I tell this story, and I've told it many times, I usually stand, but I'll do it sitting down because of the microphone. He said, you must stand and be totally connected with the earth. And then when you want to speak, you must allow the words to come from the earth, through your body, and then out through your mouth. And if you don't know what to say, you don't look out here at all. You go down back into the earth, and you search, and you search, and you search, until you find the right words to say. So again, and picking up on what you said, Lee, it is not to do with a search for meaning. It is to do with a making of meaning. And it is a making of meaning. For me, it is a making of meaning through myth. I mean, my whole work is to do with trying to find a way in which actors can relate to myth. So it's not just something for children.
Yeah.
That the myths actually do live within us. There are paintings that the Aboriginal people do with the dots, yes? And
Australian.
Yeah, the
Australian.
Australian, yeah. And I mean, a lot of them are very simple ones with there's a fire and there's two people sitting by the fire and maybe there's a kangaroo. But their belief is that when you look at that picture, there is a story in that picture. But according to the age of your soul, you see the stories that lay beneath that and beneath that and beneath that. Now, the thing is that when I went to Australia last, I saw some of these dot paintings which were very, very different. And if you looked at them, you would say that they were simply abstract art. But they're still dots. But what they are is they are a representation of the land, of the songlines. So when you look at these, you see the myths that exist under these paintings, but they're the myths that actually exist within you. I mean, and to me, that is what this is about. And that is what these stories are about. They're about not as saying the Lion, Witch of the Border is this myth. What are the myths that exist within us that we connect with through this story? So that the hero's journey that I talk about is like a guide. You know, it's not like it's a kind of a guide that helps us to go further. But it's to do with the reigniting or the resurrection or whatever one wants to call it of our own myths. But they're not myths necessarily that we can write down. Yeah. You know? They are myths that do exist in our imaginations. And my hope always is that these myths do exist in the area of two-headed serpents.
I think they, on some levels, they always do. I think, and so for me, this is fascinating, Lee. Thank you. And for me, as I look at myth, I think we actually are living in it all the time. We don't necessarily see it that way, and I think part of it is that in Western European post-Enlightenment culture, we have secularized our thinking, and I think some great gifts came with that. But I also think some great costs came with that. And so I think a lot of the myths that we are actually residing in any kind of conscious way, certainly, for example, in the U.S., and I don't know how different Canada is. This would actually be very interesting to hear. You know, we have a big myth about this sense of rugged individualism and making something out of nothing in the U.S., that is very, very steeped in American culture about how we move and expand into things, and new is good, and innovation is what we are about. And that sort of secular myth sits behind a whole lot of stuff that happens in the U.S. I'm guessing Canada is similar, but I'm sure has some different nuances because the cultures are a bit different. And what we forget, though, is, I think, a number of things, one of which is the myth that actually is living in the landscape. And I think that's one of the gifts that Lee and her people are fighting to not have destroyed, because if you destroy that, you destroy a culture. You destroy, if you ignore it as a dominant culture, it's a way, I think, to erase and make invisible, or at least try to. And living in the Catskill Mountains now, I'm just starting to learn about some of the indigenous stories that reside in those mountains, both from the native peoples who were here before any Europeans came, and then the folks that also came after that, who brought their own sort of landscape to it as well. And so for me, it's a dance between what's working in us imaginally, what's working in us psychologically and spiritually, and how we sit in this kind of nested context that is always there even if we don't see it. So the two-headed serpent can be in the room without me being aware of it, right? But that doesn't make it any less real. Exactly. That doesn't make it any less relevant. I just haven't necessarily noticed it.
Yeah. Not everybody sees it. I don't even see some things. We have seers for that, who can see what's in the room. I want to respond to a couple things that you said, and then I want to respond to you. First of all, I don't make meaning. We use words very specifically. To make something, I make a carving, I make a weaving, I actually create it. Meaning exists. I either understand it or do not, which is what you're saying. And the way we create understanding is by sitting around in a very large group and talking about it. When I say we use our mythology, this is, if you think of it this way, you're sitting there with Justin Trudeau and the rest of Parliament, and they're making a decision about something, and somebody brings up, well, in the Chronicles of Narnia, blah, 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 blah. It wouldn't happen. It does happen in my world. That's what I mean, that we rely on our stories for understanding and for the next step forward. An example is the Hunt of Iris. Anybody remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They went to this old lady, the scientist, and the native guy, who was also a scientist, by the way, Emerson. And they went to this old lady, and she told them the story about the mouse and how he's not supposed to live in the house. And so it seemed very surreal to the scientist, so he ignored it. And the guy says, we should check. Emerson says, we should check the mice. And the scientists ignored him. And so more people died. And finally Emerson decides to check the mice. Because he's a scientist, he could do this, and he did. And of course, that's where hantavirus came from, was the mice. The mice are not supposed to live in the house. That's the teaching. And so while the people may have forgotten what the repercussions of mice living in the house, They should have remembered the mice don't live in the house. This is our responsibility with mythology. The Inuits, too, they have a myth about communicating with whales, and we have the same myth. So anyway, these 3 whales got stuck in the Arctic in the ice, and they were sending icebreakers from Russia, which was going to take 3 weeks or something like that. And the 2 Inuit guys, one an old one and one a young one, said, we can sing them out. They're our relatives. And of course, the scientists laughed at them and said, no, we'll be fine. Well, one of them died and the other was very stressed out, the female who was pregnant. And every day these Inuit came and said, we can sing them out. And finally one biologist says, well, that icebreaker's not coming for another 2 weeks. Why don't we just let them try? They're not going to hurt anything. So they drilled holes every 100 meters right out to the ice, the edge of the ice. And they started to sing in the first hole, and the whales started to follow their voice. And they followed them out to sea. And the scientists started to wonder about our mythology. And so there's a group now that studies the science of holy knowledge. But this is what I mean by working with our mythology on a day-to-day basis. We did have science, but it was wrapped up in our mythology. And so people thought, what? You could travel to the, through space? Yeah, we believe that we can. Nobody knows what we can or cannot do. And somehow someone declared themselves the knower, the person who gets to say what's true and what's not. And we let him get away with it. And I think that if mythology teaches anything, is let's not pretend we know.
I think there's something really fascinating about the panel, and that is everybody came to these books, to these chronicles, at a different stage in their life. Lee as a child, me
Which
as,
I've not outgrown, by the way.
but I was a young man. I was, I think, in early years of university. David was a man, and Lee, you just came to a. But
That's maybe the best time.
our responses are all fairly similar, although a little bit different too. I mean, we brought different material to the reading. A child brings something different from an adult. They're not children's books necessarily, although they're read by children. They're not adult books either, because they're read by children. Doesn't matter when you come to them. Is there a difference? Lee, when you came very recently to these books, and you bring a whole wealth of material and experience and mythologies to the books, does that mean that you got a richer reading than Lee, who read it as a child?
I don't think so. I think I probably am skating on thin ice like those Inuits. I think I brought a bit of a shallow reading because I have
You sing
some...
beautifully.
Thank you. I do have a keynote, Anyway, I bring a lot of blinkers, a lot of filters. So what I got from C.S. Lewis was that dogged love of words and language and meaning throughout the Chronicles. I don't think he called them the Chronicles, actually, the books. And his discovery of a character, and then it opening the door to the rest of the mythologies that came after. I think it was the lion, he said, came bounding to him. And I believe that. I'm a fiction writer, so, I'm using the double-headed serpent, but suddenly the mink intervenes and wants to tell the story. This is my story, this is my story. And mink's an evil little character, by the way. They're blood-sucking little vampires. They are badass, and we love them. So the mink tells the story. This badass little character tells the story. And then the sea became alive. The sea came alive. And everything else sort of came out of that. It was just such an adventure. And so I find that writers have that in common, I think. Even when they're recreating an old mythology, which is what I'm doing, I'm not creating a whole new story here, although it is a whole new take on the double-headed serpent, but I'm using an old mythology the way we would have many, many thousands of years ago. When we myth make, we create a meaning of it for that day. You know, what does this story, how does this story play out today? And so then you find a connection with this person that's not even here in this world, that you've never met, that's from another country. And it's extremely uplifting and hopeful for me in a completely different context. Yeah, that we can find our way together through our mythologies, that our mythologies can bring us together.
What I loved about what you said was that you used the metaphor, or the words. Words are powerful. You said it opens the door. And in some sense, what is a wardrobe?
Exactly.
It is a door into a completely different world.
I don't know.
Someone mentioned Tolkien, I think it was you,
Yeah.
and they were good friends, but they were also, I think, what's called frenemies. They had two almost absolutely different ways of looking at the world in some ways. I mean, they looked at mythologies differently. And I'm curious to know what you think about that. I mean, both of them became, they were members of a group called the Inklings in Oxford. They both became vastly important writers with huge audiences after their death in some cases too. But
Like Joseph Campbell, incidentally, actually.
not unlike Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
What is that difference? Can you try to characterize the difference between?
I think they were ultimately more similar than they were different in a lot of ways. And incidentally, actually, Tolkien is one of the people that Lewis credits with bringing him back into the Christian fold. He was raised as in Irish Ireland as a Christian, and then fell away, was a pretty confirmed atheist, and then found the Anglican tradition. Though Tolkien was Catholic, and I think part of it was, I don't know how many of you guys spend time in academic worlds, but the fights are about tiny little dots, right? So I think they had fun arguing about where they sat. And Tolkien was much more of a purist about mythology and how he used it. So when he created the land of the Lord of the Rings, he was really building fairly literally off of Norse structures. And Lewis was a polymath, you know. He was intrigued. He was pulling from all sorts of traditions and was not a literalist in even how he used them. Certainly, as he talks about Silenus or Bacchus, or, you know, if you read the Greek myths, these guys were pretty darn wild, and he's put them in a place where these little kids are talking about jollification, right? You know, so he's which I also think is part of what they were. Like, I don't think he was disrespectful of the tradition, but he was fictionalizing, he was myth making in a very particular way that was, in its own way, I think, much more fluid than Tolkien's was. So I think that's what they liked arguing about as much as anything else, is how literal does your translation or reimagining or myth-making need to be, and how wide can you cast the net? And I think they had a great time arguing about that.
It's interesting, there are children in Narnia. I mean, the children get into Narnia. There are no children in Middle-earth.
Yes,
And does that make it easier for a human being to get into Narnia, to get into the mythological world?
I think so. I think, and David may have thoughts about this as well, but I think I think in part, as Leah suggested, we separate our church and state, you know, in a very literal way. And so kids are invited to imagine that way differently. And the difference for me, and I grew up reading both of those books, and I have revered the Tolkien books, but didn't love them in the same way because I couldn't reside in them. I'm not a hobbit. I'm not an elf, you know, but I was a little kid, and still, as I said, arguably am. So I can step into Narnia in a way that I can't step into. It's about, the Tolkien books are about another culture to me. I can see the similarities and I can see the connections, but these books are about me stepping into a world that I want to live in, as opposed to being in a world that's very separate and different. Do you think that's true?
Oh, yes, I do.
also?
I mean, for me, even more so, because in the books, they're British, they're English.
Right,
You know what I mean?
right.
Oh, yeah.
But a really interesting thing for me is, and I don't know whether any of you have actually seen The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, but here you have the 4 children who are all played by adults. And that, to me, is fascinating, because it becomes, like as you said, they're
become
not just
everyman.
children's stories.
Yeah.
This play is not just a children's play.
Yeah.
It is, and it is for adults. And for me, that connection there of seeing those children played by adults, is another invitation into that mythology, and then another connection into the magic.
Lee, did you have any trouble getting into that world, into that magic?
No, well, no. You know, I could get into a commercial because it's just a really short story that's full of bull, but you know. Me and my grandkids will get into any story. I think I'm halfway there before anybody opens their mouth. I'm just thinking of Tolkien and The Hobbit. I don't know. I haven't made it through a Tolkien novel yet. I think it's sort of like my War and Peace.
Yeah.
One of these days, you bastard, I'm going to finish you. But I did see The Hobbit as played by my son-in-law, Herbie Barnes, and my daughter playing every other character, they said. They said, Herbie Barnes is the Hobbit and Columba Bob is everybody else. But that's not exactly true. She did have 6 roles, though. But I remember this. My granddaughter was with me. She was 7, and I think it was Lorne, the corner gas guy, the Indian on corner. Cardinal, yes, thank you. He was playing the evil guy with the spider web or whatever, and he was attacking the Hobbit, and my little granddaughter jumps up and says, Lorne, you leave Herbie alone. You know you're bigger. And everybody started. She was not caught up in the mythology whatsoever. I was more caught up in it than her. But anyhow, so I do think it's kind of oriented toward adults, not so much children. If you look at Narnia and the movie I saw, it was very definitely a kid's fantasy world, but it's also a really beautiful ride for an adult to sail through all your generations, which is what it was for me, like from childhood to adulthood, and to just sail through that and know that I was a heroic child. I was a heroic child. At 9 years old, I walked from Abbotsford to Vancouver, which is 35 miles, to save 10 cents.
Wow.
Because it meant a loaf of bread. I made it. I was a very heroic child. So that's what catches me with Narnia, I think. And I don't see that so much in Tolkien.
I'm just curious about that walk from Abbotsford to Vancouver. What was the myth, or what gave you the power to do that?
Well, you know, Raven steals the light. I don't know if you know that story. Raven steals the light. And what my grandmother used to say is, whenever you meet someone, you steal their light. And then when you need it, you shine it back. So I had a lot of light. And our dance requires light-footedness. I don't know if you've ever seen Salish dance, but you have to jump 6 feet off the ground. And it's but it requires you to be light, to be light. And so that's what I used to get myself home. I didn't even blister my feet.
Wow.
I was also thin, so it was easy to be light.
Please, if you have written questions, could you raise your hand and one of the ushers will come and pick them up, and I'll try to incorporate that into the conversation. But there's another name that hasn't been mentioned, but is often mentioned. If it's said that Joseph Campbell discovered certain mythological realities in all of literature, in all of culture, in all of the way we live in this world. Behind Joseph Campbell, people often see somebody called Carl Jung. And
He studied us.
sorry?
Yes, he did.
He
Didn't
studied
he? Yeah,
indigenous people.
Yeah, Jung studied. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that is an important connection as well. And what it does is it grounds it not necessarily in our DNA, but certainly in our psychology. It gives it something that is more rooted, more powerful, more, I guess, with your feet on the ground, hearing the messages coming from deeper sources.
He was good at stealing light.
And my academic work very much informed by Jung, the graduate work I did, and and he had some really interesting insights. He also had some limitations, and I think one of the great things that he brought was a way to understand myth as living in our psyche in a very particular way. He was one of the first generation of psychologists. I think he made some brilliant leaps and understandings. I also think he blew it in some ways. And I think one of the biggest ways he did was that in the era that he was emerging, and his thought was emerging, and he was a protege of Freud's, and then they had a big break and fight and didn't speak again forever, really. But they were trying to legitimize this way of thinking about how human beings find meaning and figure out who they are. And they're living in an era when science in Western Europe is the thing. So they decided that psychology was a science. I think they were wrong. I think it's an art. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's a split. And so one of the places where again, the gift that he brought was understanding mythology and what he talked about as the collective unconscious, so how we find these images. Archetypes is a word that he used a lot, which are sort of the big memes, that work through cultures, that some often are there are different ones in different cultures, but there are also a lot of ones that emerge that are kind of cross-cultural, and so very much informed Campbell's work in that way. But I think that another mistake he made is that he saw myth as being somehow in service to psychology. I think psychology is in service to myth. And I think maybe, if I'm understanding Lee well, that's one of the places where her tradition is different than a Western European-based tradition, is that I think your culture sees myth as being the meta in a way that inhabits you differently than where we've put it in the way that we work. Now, again, that's separating out. There are a lot of people listening to you talk about how in your culture, as people are talking about decisions on a legislative level, that these are informed by the religion and the stories and the mythologies that sit underneath your culture. We've got in the U.S. right now, I think Canada has versions of this as well, some kind of wild ways that that's coming to the front with some very fundamentalist beliefs in a culture that prides itself on separating religious belief and secular belief. So it's not easy. Like these are messy intersections that we have culturally.
I mean, the interesting thing, I'm relating this now to theatre, but I mean, the interesting thing about Jung is way back, one of my teachers, Jan Malmgren, he developed a whole process of teaching of acting along with a student of Jung's. So his whole process of work combines the work of Jung with the work of Rudolf Laban.
Of course. Oh,
and
beautiful.
Rudolf Laban's work is totally physical.
Yes.
So it was the bringing together really of the myth and the physical, so that the myths are actually explored in, for want of a better word, dance. Although it's not a dance where steps are learned. It is a dance of images.
Which again is a difference between your culture and Western European culture, too. I think, Lee, is Dan said
Yeah,
our
just
point
to be
is not-
clear, I think we're the only people on this continent that don't have a creator or a god or any of that sort of thing. We're the genuine pagans of North America. So I wouldn't say we had a religion per se. What we have is a recognition that we have beliefs. And that these beliefs come from both our ancestry and from ourselves, in engagement of our ancestry and our present. And the ancestry is mythological.
And incidentally, actually, the non-monotheistic, the sort of the big three, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, talk about religion. The Greeks and Romans didn't talk about having religion either. So they talked about it much more the way that you talk about it. Right. So that there was an understanding that there's a whole series of things happening, but they didn't necessarily define it as a religion per se.
Right.
Lee, I want to question one thing you said too, and you talk about the importance of words, and I think words are crucial. You also speak about the way that Indigenous people in Canada have been not only sidelined, but virtually exterminated. One of the things that is being exterminated is language. Can you keep your myths without your languages?
I think that we were punished for speaking the language. I think that's different. Language is not an object. It's not in a shoebox under the bed. It can't be stolen, exterminated, or lost. You either speak it or you do not. Now, here's the interesting thing, and we've always believed this. The language is in the body, and it came from the land. Is the sound of water. That's where I come from, and that's one of the words in Israel. That's how we say hello. That's how we say I hold you up. All of these things are part of the water world I come from. So it's there. At least I totally believe that our bodies carry this language. And now the science of holy knowledge people is verifying that. Our problem right now as Indigenous people is that our brains speak English and our bodies speak the language. And so we have a lot of autoimmune diseases in my community. 25% of us don't recognize our own bodies. And I believe that's because we're not speaking the language with our minds that our body is speaking. So we don't understand ourselves. And so there's a lot of work being done to reclaim the language. We actually have more speakers that are children now than we did in the 50s. So I know this has been said by white folks for a long time, and you probably heard it, that's why you're repeating it, that our language and culture is dying, and it's been said since 1820. And, I'm still, I can still do this. I don't think you can kill a language unless, like the Beotacs, you kill all of them. You have to kill all of us. If there's even a dreamer left, that's how I started speaking the language again. I dreamed of it. I dreamed in the language, and I woke up in the night and I started writing down the things that I dreamed. And our language doesn't have a written language till recently, so I had to do it kind of phonetically, and we have problems like, how do you spell that? Somebody said a big 7 will do, okay, I'll do that. Which is another one most of our words don't have vowels. So there's difficulty in writing it, but there are young people now speaking it and teaching it to children. And there are people that are elders that are now healed enough to not be terrified to speak it. It's not that they forgot it or that they lost it. It's that they were brutalized for uttering their own words. I think that's a different thing. So it's coming back.
Good. I want to talk for a while about the role of the creator. And this is either C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles, or it is whoever wrote the play, the director of the play, the actors in the play. And if the direction of this conversation is going, that there are certain archetypal stories, there are certain narratives that are common across all cultures. There are things that unite us. Does that not create a fairly significant danger for a creator, an author, for example? He gets this mythological narrative, and then she or he puts it onto paper. Aren't they just sort of using a coloring book? Aren't they just sort of there's your template? Fill it
They're going to come a lot faster now, right?
Faster by a coloring book.
Well, you see, I like to think of it like, I mean, we'll talk about, for instance, doing a Shakespeare play, and I'm going to use a quote that is not mine. It's a quote of Glenn Gould's. I like to think what I'm doing is, as a director, I am directing what Shakespeare didn't know he was writing. Because you see, I think in terms of what there is what is written, and that exists on the surface, and that can be any archetypal story. But you see, as a creator, as an actor, as a director, if we are really connected to our souls, things will come through that we have no idea about. That we are not conscious of. And those are the things that we are going to, in the stories, in the plays, that we are going to pass onto our audiences. Because this can be such a thing that stops this communication from happening. But all those many stories are there. There are stories in the words, you know? And we talk about losing our language. What we're losing is we're losing the connection to those words. Those words came about, and again, when they came about, they didn't come about as something that was written down. They came about as a result of what was happening in the world. A very famous voice teacher by the name of Kristen Linklater. She said, one time, she said, you know, now we can never look at the moon and say that word in the same way that before man walked on the moon. Because now it's different, you know? And I think that's the thing with the words that we use. And this is, again, Jung and the collective unconsciousness, is that, you know, it just goes back and back and back. It's welcoming our ancestors. And those things are in the words. And so, no, I don't think it is a colouring book at all.
And I would agree, and I think that's a great Glenn Gould quote. And I would say that the next person
He
who
says
directs,
about Bach, not about Shakespeare.
Bach, yes.
Yes.
But the next person who plays Bach, or who directs Shakespeare, or who writes a novel engaging with a myth, is exploring their version of what they know that the other teller or performer of this myth or piece of music or piece of art didn't know. So I think for me it's that intersection of all of the things that we remember. You know, the Greeks talked about Mnemosyne was the goddess of memory in Greece. She was also the first of the three muses, and then the mother of the muses in a later incarnation. So the Greeks understood that imagination resides in the past and the present at the same time. So I think our sense of the word moon is shaped not only by what comes in behind us, but also what's in front of us as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm more affected by the bombing of the moon than what man walking on it, although a lot of indigenous people predicted the bombing of the moon because man walked on it, a certain man. But anyway, I want to say something about Ms. Linklater. I want everyone to think about this very carefully, about making proclamations for the rest of the world. It's very dangerous. I also want to say this about the imagination. It's the thing I love. Now, nothing here exists think of science and all the spaces they showed you in these molecules and atoms and electrons and protons and stuff, and there's nothing covering them, and there you are, you're firstborn, and nothing's convoluted, and your mother tries to hold you to her chest, and she tries to look at you, and you're going like this. This is so funny when babies do that, because they can't actually see you. And that's terrifying, because they can smell you and they can recognize you, but where are you? Well, it takes a few days for the imagination to convolute. It's the first part of the brain to convolute. It's always what we should go back to. It's what Einstein went back to come up with the theory of relativity. And I remember doing an essay in college in physics saying that Einstein verified that shape-shifting was possible, and completely freaked out my science teacher because it was scientifically sound. But he just couldn't buy it. That's mythological Einstein. But that's why they gave him a headdress.
There's time for one more question, and it'll just be a brief one, but I'd be very interested to hear from each of you what you think the ideal reaction or response is from reading the books, from seeing the play. You're confronting what we've been describing as a mythology that has obvious power. What should you take home from it? When you finished reading the books, what's the best response? What would make C.S. Lewis happy?
All right, I'll jump in first because they're going to be more profound than me. That's how you know how to work a panel, is you don't end up being the button. So I think it's about stepping out and finding the imagination and the magic and the myth in your own life, and making it and engaging with it, and seeing the places where your sense of who you can most be and the wonderfully wild things that you want to bring to the world, how you can bring that wardrobe door into your life. And so you're bringing Narnia into your life rather than feeling like it's another place.
David?
Well, I mean, I totally agree. What you would take away is that it is possible to open that door. Mm-hmm. And opening the door actually is really easy.
I don't have a door, so I don't know what to say to this question, but I'll say this. When we go into the longhouse and we hear story, and the storyteller, which just this past year my nation had me represent them as the head CM, which is a tremendous responsibility. It's probably on YouTube by now. It's at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. First time I was at that theatre and wasn't an audience. My grandfather was there for a play many years ago, but there I was all by myself. Anyway, what they say is the people should come out of the story bigger than they went in. Wow. And I think that happens with Narnia. You come out of there bigger than you went in. But my hope is that you eliminate the door.
Wow.
So it's easier. What if you lose the key?
Thank you. Thank you so much. David Latham, Lee Maracle, Lee Melander, and Paul Kennedy, thank you for coming on your way out. Please pick up our July calendar. We're almost at the end of June. There's lots more forum events through the rest of the season, and so I hope to see you back again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
That was wonderful.